Welcome back, Spare Parts Army. Over the past decade, the Egyptian military has waged a major land battle against ISIS on their own territory. And the crazy thing about this story is it hasn't gotten much attention in the Western media, but in the Middle East, it's been a major ongoing problem that has consequences on the current crisis in the region. When Operation Eagle first kicked off in August 2011, the Egyptian military deployed 2,500 troops, armored vehicles, special forces brigades, main battle tanks, and attack helicopters on their own territory inside the Sinai Peninsula, largely on the sensitive border with Israel. Since then, the battle has extended in one form or another, all the way to 2023, when the Egyptian government finally declared it over. It would kind of be like if, imagine the US military deployed to the border with Mexico to take out armed militia groups who had taken over major cities. The mission's goal was to crush ISIS militants and an insurgency that had spiraled out of control, threatening the region's natural resources and vital trade routes. We'll see how, over the course of a decade, the Egyptian military's counterinsurgency strategy evolved from one of brute force to collaboration with local tribes, revealing lessons about the kind of innovative steps that it takes to defeat a force like ISIS. But first, the only way we're able to continue to grow our team is thanks to this video sponsor, Odoo. Odoo is a business software solutions platform. They're a set of 30 main applications that are regularly updated and installed by over 5 million users worldwide, ranging from startups with 1 user all the way up to large enterprises with 300,000 plus users. One of the more popular apps is their CRM app, used to generate leads, create quotations, and close deals. With the CRM app, it's easy to create beautiful custom quotes in a few easy steps using the PDF builder. Odoo's customer service is always available by live chat, allowing customers to get their issues addressed promptly. All major business data sets are consolidated into an easy-to-read summary sheet in the app dashboard, breaking down important info and stats like lead generation month-to-month, total sales and revenue, product sales month-to-month, and a lot more. The Odoo apps provide business owners and managers with all the necessary info to launch and maintain company operations as efficiently as possible. So click the link down below to check out Odoo today. The Sinai Peninsula is often called the bridge between continents because it connects Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. It happens to be located in one of the most strategically important places in the entire world because it forms the eastern half of the vital Suez Canal, where about 15% of global trade passes through each year. 6 million barrels worth of oil transit the canal every day. Essentially, a blockade of this route would block $9 billion of commerce every day. Historically speaking, the Sinai Peninsula has long served as a route for smuggling of weapons and supplies. This is why the stakes were so high when the insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula reached unprecedented levels of violence by 2011. Extremist groups had entrenched themselves, utilizing the region's rugged terrain and lack of governance to launch deadly attacks, eventually controlling about a third of the villages in the peninsula. And when the country of Libya fell in 2011, heavy weapons flowed straight in from there to Egypt. In the years leading up to Egypt's Operation Eagle, the insurgency had sabotaged 15 oil pipelines and frequently targeted infrastructure critical to the Suez Canal. These efforts to destabilize Egypt even shut down the Arab gas pipeline, which cost nearby Jordan $2 billion each year. The first step of Egypt's Operation Eagle was to regain control by setting up checkpoints throughout 3 key locations. The first was Arish, then they went on to secure the city of Rafah, that's in Egypt, then they moved into Sheikh Zayed. Hundreds of gunmen rode through the town, firing at police stations. As an outsider looking in, it sounds to me like the Wild West. But if you're someone who lives there, please comment below if I'm characterizing this in some way incorrectly. As the Egyptian military forces crossed over into the Sinai Peninsula, many residents living there initially thought it was just another regular crackdown. What followed would be far more intense and last far longer than that. For the next year, Egyptian troops regularly patrolled these towns and engaged in combat against insurgent groups. Most of the militant activity was in the northern half of the peninsula, centered around these 3 strongholds close to Gaza and the Mediterranean coast. The fighting took place over the difficult topography of the Sinai, which ranges from farmlands, deserts, and mountains to residential cities. They had 4 stated goals: protect the Suez Canal, eliminate violent extremists, enhance border security and prevent smuggling, protect Egyptian citizens, and enable a better quality of life. Complicating matters for the Egyptian government was the fact that their military couldn't deploy any forces into the Sinai Peninsula without first clearing the deployment with Israel and an organization called the Multinational Force Observers. The MFO is this task force that was established after Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt as part of the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. So its job is to enforce that peace treaty and monitor this demilitarized zone in the Sinai Peninsula. And one of the conditions of the agreement was that both Israel and Egypt would limit their military presence in the area. The MFO is kind of like having a peer mediator from HR assigned to live with you 24/7 at your house. Part of the reason following these guidelines in war is important is because it helps avoid things like sanctions against your nation. However, neither side could have foreseen this future where insurgent groups would take advantage of this reduced security and rise up to fight against both of them here. In fact, many believe these security provisions of that peace treaty is part of what enabled these militants to operate here unchecked for decades, and so the Sinai Peninsula has long been known for its lawlessness. After negotiations, Egypt was granted special permissions by Israel and the MFO to deploy troops for the first time to the Sinai Peninsula in order to deal with the rising insurgency. Any steps of escalation, like airstrikes, use of tanks and armored vehicles, had to first be approved. As with many counterinsurgency missions, the initial stages appeared to achieve their goals, with the Egyptian forces securing these designated sectors. But as the months rolled on, the fighters continued to show they were able to regularly harass both Egyptian and Israeli forces on both sides of the border. The confusion between various factions fighting here led to the Israeli and Egyptian soldiers firing at each other in one incident, and they accidentally left 5 Egyptians KIA. Incidents like these risk triggering escalation between the nations. In an attempt to help with the Egyptian operations, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta at the time gave the Egyptian government access to classified intelligence assets. Egypt was given access to updated satellite imagery, drone reconnaissance, and cell phone intercepts. The alliance here provided insight into the militants' attacks and planning. To this end, the United States has given $1.3 billion of military aid to Egypt each year since the late 1970s and provided on-the-ground training for their forces. But these training missions had been put on hold as Egypt was in the middle of a crisis. One of the factors that led to this happening in the first place was the 2011 Arab Spring Revolution. A huge wave of demonstrations swept the Middle East and North Africa. Egypt's President Mubarak and his authoritarian rule had dominated Egypt's politics for 30 years. While the revolution succeeded, it also plunged the country into chaos. Extremist groups exploited this opportunity. After more than a year of fighting, the militants seemed to only be getting stronger and carrying out even more brazen attacks, the worst of which would kick off years of renewed battle. In August of 2012, a platoon of armed insurgents attacked a base in Rafah, close to the border with Israel, killing 16 Egyptian soldiers. The insurgents stole 2 armored cars that they used to bash their way through a checkpoint into Israel. The IDF was confused at first, seeing Egyptian vehicles burst into their country. The insurgents sped toward their target of a nearby town full of civilians, when an IDF airstrike and a firefight with infantry on the ground eliminated them. They had made it a full 2 kilometers into Israel. All of this is connected to the crisis we see today, because Israel had to ask Egypt for permission to send troops and tanks to Rafah and tanks to the border with Egypt. These security problems threatened to pull larger countries into the war, like the United States, Egypt, and Israel, through some type of accident or by inflamed politics. The problem is a classic counterinsurgency one. Even if you eliminate 30 militants per day, 50 might join ISIS's ranks the following day. Chapter 1 of the United States Counterinsurgency Field Manual points this problem out, stating, "A government that abuses its people or is tyrannical generates resistance to its rule. People who have been injured, maltreated, victimized, dishonored, or had close friends or relatives killed by the government, particularly by its security forces, may lash back at their attackers." End quote. That's why I think it's important that we briefly talk about who some of these insurgents actually are, not as a caricature, but actually try to understand what makes them tick. Because the Sinai is a much more arid and less developed area than the rest of Egypt. There's a large population of about 200,000 people in Bedouin tribes who have a long history of making a home out of this harsh landscape. The Egyptian government has been accused of discriminating against these communities, often seen as depriving them of essential services in favor of ethnic Egyptians, or even forcefully kicking them out of prime real estate to build tourist resorts along the Red Sea. According to The Economist, the Bedouins are barred from joining the Egyptian army or police, and they even find it difficult to find jobs in tourism. The Bedouin people weren't happy with the state of affairs, and their grievances with the Egyptian government had been building for decades. So when the 2011 Arab Spring Revolution kicked off, and security forces in the country were focused on restoring order in the mainland, hundreds of Bedouin people in the Sinai seized the opportunity and rebelled. Most Bedouins don't support the militant group's ideology. However, some did cooperate out of what they saw as the government's failure to address their needs. The largest of the factions would eventually pledge their allegiance to ISIS, officially forming the Sinai Islamic State. Additional militants based in Libya reportedly established ties with these groups as well. I know sometimes I get confused with trying to keep all these different factions, alliances, and allegiances straight. It's like a confusing episode of Lost. The Hamas militant group in Rafah inside Gaza aren't necessarily aligned with the ISIS militant group inside Rafah on the Egyptian side of the border. In fact, the two are often clashed with each other over ideological differences. ISIS doesn't like, for instance, that Hamas is more focused on Palestinian causes. What a tangled web we weave. With things continuing to escalate, the Egyptian military decided they needed to make some changes if they were going to defeat this force. Up until now, they've been largely acting as an internal security force whose main purpose was to keep dissent in check instead of as a maneuver force. And no matter how brave some of their individual soldiers are, some of the top brass in Egypt regularly appointed people to leadership based on loyalty. This kind of system made it hard for Egyptian troops to properly fight. They worked on restructuring their forces, though, to a more merit-based system and doubled down on their deployment. In response to these attacks, Egypt launched an even bigger ground campaign that they called Operation Sinai in late 2012, with the expanded aim of destroying ISIS smuggling tunnels. Now, an additional 8,000 Egyptian troops were committed to the battle. Their goal was to shut down the illegal arms trade. ISIS in Sinai made use of a vast network of smuggling tunnels built under Gaza to get around the military blockade on the border. This trade amounted to $500 million a year, helping fuel both ISIS and Hamas. In response, Egypt deployed F-16 and Mirage 2000 fighter jets, artillery, additional tanks, and their elite El Saka special forces. According to United States intelligence, there were 24 militant bases with at least 12,000 fighters scattered throughout the region. ISIS fought back with daily RPG, mortar, and small arms attacks. But then, in January of 2014, ISIS shot down an Egyptian Mi-17 helicopter using an Igla missile launcher, a devastating loss. IED attacks had gotten so common that Egypt banned the use of 4x4 pickups and SUVs anywhere near their checkpoints. By 2018, the Egyptian Defense Forces had deployed 42,000 troops across 88 battalions to fight against ISIS. By 2018, Egypt was reportedly destroying 4,000 buildings a year in the Sinai. They deployed flamethrowers and bulldozers to destroy land that they believed was assisting ISIS. 90% of the Al Rish province farmland was destroyed in the fighting. It was time for a new strategy, one that called for more than just additional troops with bigger guns. And here's how Egypt turned this battle back in their favor. Egypt itself had been changing in the years since the start of the insurgency operations. After a brief stewardship by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, Mohamed Morsi was elected president in 2012. But Morsi's ties to the Muslim Brotherhood soon led to mass protests in Egypt in 2013. Over 30 million Egyptians protested against him. Egypt was facing the prospect of a revolution. And then Egypt's Minister of Defense, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, launched a military coup that overthrew Morsi and called for new elections that he subsequently won in a landslide. El-Sisi was the former director of military intelligence, but his experience in the intelligence community proved to be of benefit. Following the coup, the insurgent groups increased attacks against Egypt's military and security personnel once more. According to the New York Times, Egypt then allowed the Israeli Air Force to covertly conduct numerous airstrikes against ISIS targets in the Sinai Peninsula, and the two sides cooperated on intelligence sharing as well, although Egyptian and Israeli officials denied this secret alliance. Cooperation between these two former enemies is something that they both kind of loathe to admit, but a US analysis after the fact showed that coordinated strikes, whoever conducted them, were effective. Over the years of fighting ISIS, Egypt's General Intelligence Service had become far more proficient at identifying the primary routes used to smuggle in heavy weapons from Libya, so the Egyptian Navy was able to blockade sea routes. Meanwhile, this in turn allowed police and ground forces to start to make a dent in the tunnel network and desert crossings that had evaded them for years. With the peninsula effectively cut off from the outside world, ISIS's supply lines took a big hit. By 2018, isolated insurgent groups were surrendering without a fight because they'd simply run out of food and supplies. But even as ISIS was severely weakened by the siege, bombings in the Sinai continued. Two last steps needed to be taken by Egypt, and they proved to be extremely effective. The first was Egypt's investment and alliance into the Union of Sinai Tribes. The Union of Sinai Tribes was a group of Bedouin tribal leaders interested in fighting against ISIS. The tribal militias started to build trust with the Egyptians and Bedouin people by working with the Bedouin tribes instead of against them. Bedouin villages could safeguard their own communities from a common enemy, refusing to harbor ISIS fighters. It's similar to the counterinsurgency program that the United States military used in Iraq that I saw when they had the Sons of Iraq, which was sort of a situation where we paid former insurgents money to contribute to security instead of degrade it. From the US Counterinsurgency Field Manual, it makes a quote about this saying, "By mid-tour, US forces should be working closely with local forces, training or supporting them, and building an indigenous security capability. The natural tendency is to create forces in a US image. This is a mistake. Instead, local indigenous forces need to mirror the enemy's capabilities and seek to supplant the insurgents' role." That right there is what Egypt's doing, and it's a key part of the puzzle. They're creating forces that are similar to the insurgents in capabilities and tactics, and they mirror the insurgents, but they're fighting alongside the Egyptians. Critics claim this approach of creating an armed tribe stood up a lawless vigilante group, but the move was effective at slowing ISIS recruitment down to a trickle. President Sisi also pledged over 700 billion Egyptian pounds worth of economic and infrastructure development over the next 8 years for the Sinai Peninsula to help alleviate the poverty and crime that made the peninsula such a hotbed for insurgency in the first place. That's roughly equal to $15 billion worth of new roads, tunnels, agricultural land, and power stations. With Egypt's economy facing an economic crisis since 2020, it's uncertain exactly how much the country can afford for that program, but it's at least a step in the right direction to bring the neglected peninsula onto a more equal footing with the Egyptian mainland. But just one final step remained. They had to cut the head of the ISIS snake off, and this is where all of the lessons learned over the past 10 years of fighting insurgencies in the Sinai would be put together. Salim al-Hamadan was one of the oldest members of ISIS Sinai and was the most wanted man for all of Egypt. So the Egyptian special forces teamed up with the Bedouin militias from the Union of Sinai Tribes to hunt him down. The Egyptian commandos, reportedly their elite Unit 777, the Counterterrorism Task Force, relied on the Bedouin scout knowledge of the landscape to track down the leads. They pursued the ISIS leader all across northern Sinai whenever they got a lead. And then, on March 23, 2021, the joint forces found him close to Rafah and the Israeli border. A massive firefight broke out, but the ISIS leader was ultimately killed in the battle. With their leadership decapitated, their recruitment down, and their supplies running low, Egypt's President Sisi declared the counter-terror operation officially ended in the Sinai Peninsula on January 25, 2023. While scattered attacks continue, and the future of the peninsula's economic development plan remains uncertain, ISIS itself agrees with President Sisi. In a video put out March 2024, ISIS declared the ISIS Sinai inactive, signaling that at least this branch of their terror enterprise was closed for the time being. Before I forget, I want to tell you guys I did the Funker 530 podcast with Ronnie over there. I had an amazing time. Click the link. It's in the description or the top corner of the screen. Thank you guys, and good morning.